40 years is a long time to sing the same song. It is long enough for the people who first heard it as teenagers to have grandchildren of their own. Long enough for the original record to have moved from new release to classic to nostalgia to something beyond nostalgia, something that sits in a different category entirely. The category of things the world has simply decided it cannot do without. Long enough for the singer herself to have moved from 25 to 35 to 50 to 60 to 72, while the song, immune to aging in the way that recordings always are, stayed exactly where it was, 6 minutes and 58 seconds. 2 voices, 1 piano chord that the whole structure hangs on. Bonnie Tyler had sung Total Eclipse of the Heart more times than she had ever tried to count. She had sung it in arenas and on cruise ships and in festival fields in the rain. She had sung it jet-lagged and with a cold and in languages she did not speak, and once memorably with a microphone stand that fell over mid-chorus and which she caught with one hand without stopping singing. She had sung it in the years when it was everywhere, and in the years when it was nowhere, and in the years when it came back again because a solar eclipse had been announced somewhere in the world, and the internet had remembered collectively and all at once that the song existed. But she had never, until the autumn of 2023, sung it on its 40th anniversary. And she had no idea, walking toward that stage on a September evening with the sound of a crowd reaching her through the walls, that the next few minutes were going to remind her of something she thought she already knew. The thing about singing the same song for 40 years is that it changes around you while staying the same. The melody does not change. The chord structure does not change. The words, desperate and theatrical and precisely, brilliantly excessive in the way that Jim Steinman's words always were, do not change. What changes is the crowd. What changes is the age of the faces in the front row. What changes is the way the song lands in the room, which is not the same as the way it landed in 1983 or in 1993 or in 2003 or in 2013, and will not be the same as the way it lands in 2033 if anyone is still there to hear it. Bonnie Tyler had watched this happen slowly, across decades. She had noticed the faces in the front row getting younger rather than older at certain points. Children of the original fans, arriving to claim the song as their own without having been alive when it was made. She had noticed the way certain generations sang along differently, some from pure muscle memory, some with the energy of discovery, some with a quality she could only describe as ownership, as though the song had always been theirs and she was simply the person who had recorded it for them. She had thought about this, over the years, more than she had generally let on. There was a question underneath the experience of singing the same song for 40 years that she had never quite answered to her own satisfaction. Whose song was it, really? Jim Steinman had written it. She had recorded it. The world had claimed it. And each of those 3 things was true simultaneously, which meant that no single one of them was entirely true alone. It was the kind of question that sounded philosophical in an interview and felt, in practice, like standing in a corridor behind a stage listening to a crowd grow louder and trying to figure out what you were actually about to walk into. The dressing room, 2 hours before, had been the same dressing room that dressing rooms in European concert halls had been for as long as she had been playing them. A mirror with lights around the edge. A table with a rider on it. Water, tea, fruit, the things she had learned over decades to ask for, rather than the things she had asked for in the 1980s. Which had been different and about which she was now quietly philosophical. A chair positioned in front of the mirror that she never sat in because she had learned that sitting down too close to a show made her feel slower rather than steadier. She had done her hair and her makeup standing, as she always did, with the low-level concentration of someone doing a technical task they had completed 10,000 times and could do with most of their mind elsewhere. The rest of her mind was where it always was in the 2 hours before a show. Not exactly rehearsing, not exactly thinking, but in a kind of open attentiveness that was not quite relaxation and not quite preparation, but something between the two that had taken her most of her career to learn to allow. There was a framed poster on the dressing room wall. She noticed it without looking for it, a promotional image from a tour in the mid-1990s, not hers, someone else's, left on the wall from a previous booking. She studied it for a moment. The mid-1990s had not been kind to her commercially. The music industry had moved in directions that had made less room for a voice like hers, and several people who should have known better had suggested, with varying degrees of tact, that the appropriate response to this situation was to adapt or to retire. She had adapted somewhat and refused to retire entirely, and the years had eventually proved her right, though the years had taken their time about it. She turned away from the poster. The crowd was audible even here, 2 corridors and a fire door away. She listened for a moment, and then went to find the corridor. She was in that corridor now. The venue was a European concert hall, the kind of place with good acoustics and a history and a capacity that sat somewhere between intimate and enormous, large enough for the song to fill properly and small enough for her to see faces in the 3rd row. The 40th anniversary tour had been her manager's idea, framed as a celebration and scheduled with the precision that touring at 72 required. More rest days than she would once have needed, a set list designed around her voice rather than around audience expectations, sound engineers who knew her voice well enough to frame it correctly. She had agreed to the tour not because the anniversary particularly moved her. She had always been faintly suspicious of milestone numbers, which were in her view a calendar's way of making things feel more significant than they were. But because she still wanted to sing. That was the simple fact underneath everything else. After 50 years of being asked why she kept going, she had come to believe that the simplest answer was always the most accurate. She kept going because she wanted to. She stood in the corridor and listened to the crowd. It was a particular kind of listening, not for specific sounds but for the aggregate quality of a room, the temperature of what was waiting for her on the other side of the door. She had been doing this for so long that she had become accurate at it. She could tell, from a corridor, whether a crowd was going to be warm or reserved, energized or waiting to be convinced, the kind that opened immediately and the kind that took 3 songs to unlock. This one sounded different from what she expected. She could not immediately say why. The volume was similar to other nights. The quality of the waiting, that anticipatory murmur of several hundred people not quite sure what to do with themselves between the support act clearing the stage and the main act appearing, was familiar. But there was something underneath it. A weight, a quality of attention that was not quite the same as the standard pre-show energy. She stood there for an extra moment. Then she thought, well, only one way to find out. She walked on stage. The lights hit her the way they always did. A physical force as much as a visual one, disorienting for the first half second and then simply there. The normal condition of being on a stage. She walked to the microphone with the specific unhurried pace of someone who has learned over 50 years that the audience will wait, and that rushing communicates anxiety rather than energy. The band was in position behind her. The microphone was where it should be. The crowd was a dark mass beyond the lights, faces visible in the first few rows, a blur of movement beyond that. And then the crowd saw her, fully. The recognition passed through the room the way recognition does in a large space, not instantly, because different people in different parts of a room see the same thing at different times, but in a wave, one part of the audience turning, and then the next, and then the next, until the whole room had arrived at the same moment simultaneously. What happened next was not applause, or rather it was not only applause, it was something that Bonnie Tyler, 72 years old, 50 years of stages behind her, had not heard directed at her in quite this way before. The crowd stood up, all of it. Not the front rows and then gradually the back. All of it, at the same moment, as though the whole room had made a single decision at once. And it did not cheer. It simply stood, in silence, for one full beat, before the applause started. A beat of silence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and felt considerably longer, in which several hundred people communicated something to each other and to the woman at the microphone that none of them could have put into words but all of them understood. She had been given standing ovations before. She had been cheered and applauded and screamed at by audiences across 40 years of stages. But she had never been stood for in silence. That was different. That was something else entirely. She did not sing immediately. She stood at the microphone and looked at them, not performing the moment, just inside it, which was not a thing she always allowed herself to do because being inside a moment on stage was a luxury that stagecraft generally required you to deny yourself. But in that 2 seconds of standing silence, something had shifted that she was not going to pretend hadn't. She said thank you. 2 words, into the microphone, And then the band began. The opening bars of Total Eclipse of the Heart are not quiet. The piano chord that begins the song strikes with a weight that has always been partly responsible for the physical reaction the song produces in live settings. A chord that lands in the chest before it reaches the ears, that signals immediately and unambiguously what is about to happen. When it struck in that room on that evening, the crowd made a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a gasp, but somewhere between the two. The sound of several hundred people responding to something physical. And then Bonnie Tyler opened her mouth and sang the first line. She had sung it 10,000 times. She had sung it so many times that there were years when she had sung it slightly apart from herself, in the efficient, technically reliable way of a performer for whom a song has become so deeply embedded that the machinery of delivery runs on its own while the conscious mind exists elsewhere. Those were not bad performances. They were professional performances, and there was nothing wrong with them. But they were not what happened in that room on that evening. What happened in that room on that evening was that she sang it as though she had never sung it before. Not because she was trying to, not because she had decided, walking down that corridor, that this performance would be different, but because the room had done something to her. That standing silence, those 2 seconds, that had rearranged something. And whatever the song was that she had carried for 40 years, she was now inside it rather than alongside it. She did not understand, in the moment, what was happening. She only understood with the specific clarity that comes from being inside a performance rather than observing it, that her voice was doing something it did not always do, something that had more to do with the crowd than with any preparation she had made. The crowd sang with her. This was not unusual. The crowd always sang with her on this song. Total Eclipse of the Heart was one of those recordings that had become so embedded in the cultural muscle memory of multiple generations that the words existed in people's bodies before they had consciously recalled them, available without retrieval, simply there. She had heard thousands of audiences sing it with her. She had heard it sung badly and loudly and with total sincerity and with the ironic affection of people who knew they were being moved by something they privately considered slightly ridiculous and did not care. But tonight they sang it differently. She could not have explained the difference technically. The volume was similar, the words were the same. The moment in the song where the crowd always surged on the chorus was the same moment. What was different was a quality that she had no word for, which was the quality of people singing something together because they needed to rather than because they wanted to. A quality of necessity. The way people in the mining villages of her childhood had sung in chapel on Sunday, not to perform faith, but because the singing was the faith, because the act itself was the thing and the words were almost beside the point. She thought of that, of chapel, of skewing, of Saturday evenings on a pavement outside a house with a piano in the doorway, in the middle of the final chorus. It arrived not as a memory but as a sensation, the specific physical feeling of standing in the middle of something larger than yourself and understanding that you are not the source of it, that you are, in some way that has nothing to do with ego or credit or chart positions, simply the place where it passes through. She had spent 40 years being asked what the song meant. She had never, until that moment, had an answer that satisfied her. After the final note, the room did what rooms do. It made noise, considerable noise, the kind that physically occupied a space and left a ringing in the ears afterward, the kind that required a specific internal settling before the next thing could begin. Bonnie Tyler stood at the microphone and let it land. She did not immediately go to the next song. She did not immediately speak. She simply stood, 72 years old, in a room full of people who had just sung 40 years of something back at her, and she let herself be in it for a moment before the professional machinery of a concert reassembled around her. What she said when she finally spoke was brief. She had always been brief when she meant something. She said, "I've been singing that song for 40 years. I thought I knew what it was. Tonight you showed me I was wrong." The room, which had been loud, went briefly quiet, then louder than before. She moved on to the next song. But the 40 years she had brought into the room with her felt, in some way she could not easily account for, different in weight from the 40 years she would carry out of it. Not lighter, just differently distributed, as though something had been shared that she had been carrying alone for longer than she realized. She moved on to the next song. But the 40 years she had brought into the room with her felt, in some way she could not easily account for, different in weight from the 40 years she would carry out of it. Not lighter, just differently distributed. As though something had been shared that she had been carrying alone for longer than she realized. In the dressing room afterward, one of her musicians, a guitarist who had been playing with her for several years, a young man who had been not yet born when the song was first recorded, and who played it with the fluency of someone who had learned it from a recording rather than a session, knocked on the door and said he wanted to ask her something. She told him to come in. He said, "Was that different tonight?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions that were genuinely asking something. "Yes," she said. "How?" She thought about it for a moment. "Usually I sing it to them," she said. "Tonight they were already singing it. I just joined in." The guitarist nodded as though this made complete sense, which it did to him because he had been on the stage and had felt the same thing from the other direction. He said goodnight. She sat for a while in front of the dressing room mirror, actually sitting now that the show was done, and looked at herself with the particular unsentimental directness that she had always applied to mirrors, which was the same directness she applied to most things. 72 years old, 50 years of stages. One song that had outlasted every trend and every decade and every version of the music industry that had tried to make her into something she wasn't. Not bad, she thought, for a doctor's mistake. She laughed at that, alone in the dressing room, at herself, at the whole improbable arc of it. Then she reached for her tea, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway, because she had always been practical about these things. There is a quality that belongs to things that have lasted. Not age exactly. Age is just time passing. Something more specific. The way that something which began as one thing accumulates, over decades, the weight of all the people it has meant something to, so that the original object, the recording, the song, the voice, becomes over time a vessel for something much larger than itself. Total Eclipse of the Heart was 6 minutes and 58 seconds long in 1983, and it was 6 minutes and 58 seconds long in 2023. And it would be 6 minutes and 58 seconds long in however many years remained. That was not going to change. The chord was the same chord. The words were the same words. What had changed, across 40 years, was the weight of all the rooms it had filled, and all the people who had sung it, and all the moments. Private moments, public moments, moments at kitchen tables at 2 in the morning, and moments on rooftops at New Year, and moments in cars on motorways with the radio suddenly loud, that had attached themselves to it like weight attaches to a thing that matters. Bonnie Tyler had not chosen to carry all of that. She had simply made a recording in 2 takes, in the winter of 1982, with a voice the doctors had told her was ruined, in a song written by a man she had had to push through several intermediaries to meet. She had walked in, she had sung, she had walked out. The weight had accumulated afterward, on its own, without her permission, because of the specific chemistry between a voice and a song and a world that was ready for exactly that combination at exactly that moment. But on a September evening in 2023, standing in a room that had just stood in silence for 2 seconds before applauding, she understood something she had not understood before. The weight was not a burden. It was the point. Every room that had filled with that song, every person who had taken it as their own, every solar eclipse that had sent it back to the top of the charts. All of that was not something that had happened to the song. It was what the song was, and the voice that carried it, cracked and hoarse and improbable and entirely itself, was not the diminished thing the doctors had once warned her about. It was, 40 years later, exactly what it had always been. The one that survived. Bonnie Tyler died on the 9th of July 2026, at the age of 75. In the days that followed, Total Eclipse of the Heart was played everywhere, as it always had been when the world needed it. The footage from the 40th anniversary tour circulated among fans, a 72-year-old woman at a microphone, a crowd on its feet in silence, 2 seconds of stillness before the noise. People watched it and pressed play again, because it was the kind of thing you wanted to see twice. She had said, on that September evening, that the crowd had shown her something she had been wrong about. She had not said what it was, but it was there in the footage, if you knew to look for it, in the 2 seconds of standing silence. in the way she stood at the microphone and let it happen, in the way she sang. Not with the efficient professionalism of 10,000 prior performances, but with something rawer and more present, the voice of a woman who had been carrying a thing for a long time and had just understood, in a room full of strangers who were also somehow not strangers, exactly what she had been carrying it for. She had thought, for 40 years, that the song was the thing she had given the world. The crowd, on a September evening in 2023, finally showed her the other way round.